Welcome to the City of Creeks Learning Series. I'm Jessica Wilson, Interim Division Manager with the Environmental Monitoring and Compliance team. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Celine Rendon to talk with us about climate change and environmental justice. Many of us met Celine through her work supporting the development of and community involvement with Austin's 2021 Climate Equity Plan. Celine has an academic background in environmental science, geography, and public policy. She's dedicated to addressing the systemic and institutional barriers that have perpetuated racial disparities for low-income communities of color, and how these communities are disproportionately affected by environmental hazards, both past and present. So thank you, Celine, for sharing your time and perspectives with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
My name is Celine Rendon. Thank you for that introduction, Jessica. I currently work at EcoRise. I'm a project specialist. I focus on our GIS and data visualization efforts where we're trying to integrate environmental education in the K through 12 space with new tools like GIS, teaching environmental justice and other climate action efforts going on locally, but also in the state and then nationally. Talking a bit about climate change, climate justice here in Austin, I'm going to be sharing more so about my trajectory and just kind of my pathway, because that's literally been the whole way of how I've learned about environmental science, environmental justice, sustainability, and climate efforts. When I was a college student studying environmental science, obviously in environmental science, it's a more traditional STEM pathway. And immediately recognizing that we weren't discussing race at all in any of our classes, thinking back to how the climate crisis that we're in started, how that has manifested, and thinking about colonialism, thinking about the impacts and systemic impacts of climate change and how that relates to inequitable health outcomes. And the only thing we learned about in college, at least in my time, was just tragedy of the commons. So just not having any racial equity lens applied of, again, why we're in the climate crisis, why were we experiencing such climate stressors and impacts, and what communities experience that the most and why. Luckily, I found out about People Organized in Defense of Earth and Our Resources, PODED, which is based in East Austin. It's a women-led, people of color, grassroots social justice organization that was formed in the 1990s to increase the participation of residents in East Austin for decisions related to economic development and environmental protection of East Austin communities. My internship specifically focused on environmental, economic, health, and cultural impacts of land use and community development. I learned so much about the history of Austin. Obviously, I think y'all might have already heard about the 1928 master plan and how that divided the city along racial lines, forcibly displacing Black and Latino residents in East Austin. And at that time, they were very specific, undesirable areas. This is kind of a fast forward to my job with the city of Austin when I helped lead the climate equity plan. It's just a fast forward because a lot of what I learned with the guidance and mentorship of Susana Almanza from PODED actually led to be our specific framing of the Austin Climate Equity Plan. So learning about some just East Austin history related to environmental justice, about the tank farm, fuel storage facility, the East Side landfill, and the Holly Power Plant, and how that expose people of color to toxic pollution. And oftentimes these are right by elementary schools, middle schools, high schools throughout East and Southeast Austin. And in those same areas for the past 5 to 10 years, we see gentrification taking place in parts of those cities where low-income people and people of color have been forced to live in the first place. The African-American share of the Austin population declined from 12% to 7% just from 1990 to 2010. This framing is really important, and it really makes me grateful just to see how long we've come to include this at the beginning of all of our Austin Climate Equity Plan outreach and engagement efforts, of how we talk about the climate plan, of how we lead with our framing around equity and climate health hazards. A lot of this work goes back to my time when I was a college student, working with Susana, working with PODED and other community groups that fought so hard to have this history be acknowledged and at the forefront of our framing when we talk about climate change. When I was working with PODED, luckily, pre-COVID, kind of take for granted those in-person meetings and gatherings. We had a lot of workshops. This was the time of Code Next. I know Matt Holland presented last month or before. This is kind of during that era of Code Next when there was a lot of community forums going on. But most of our community workshops we had were just talking to folks and residents about their experiences around major affordability issues, gentrification problems, and just how the city has transformed so much in the past 10 years. I believe this is around like 2015, 2016, really crucial part of my time learning about environmental science, but also anchoring a lot of what was happening in the local community in Austin. The bottom left photo is Linda Guerrero. This was during the protest against FC Stadium that was being proposed to be developed at Guerrero Park in Montopolis in Southeast Austin, and really an important time of solidarity where, traditional environmental groups that were primarily white-led came together to, fight for also the social justice issue for Montopolis residents and the people of East and Southeast Austin that love and care for this park and didn't want to see it be developed for a soccer stadium. And then eventually, the soccer stadium didn't get moved here, thankfully, but it was because of the efforts of groups coming together and fighting against that. Like I said, I just got to talk to so many folks, from people my age to elders and community, even setting up our framing about the history of Austin with the 1920 master plan and how we see those legacies of racism manifesting in the inequitable outcomes, quality of life outcomes for people of color throughout the city. Issues around climate change, flooding, heat, drought, directly related to health outcomes for people of color throughout Austin, and the inequities around access to healthcare, access to affordable housing, are directly related to the climate issues. I learned so much from Susana. She continues to be my mentor, someone that I talk to. And I mentioned that this was the time during Codenex. I remember going to a lot of City of Austin meetings, getting introduced to that as a college student, and just seeing how tense it was, remembering some of those watershed protection department involvement in some of the Codenex meetings. And oftentimes it was folks talking at the community of like, we have this plan, this is what's going to happen. And of course, with that, you're going to have some tension and people kind of responding to that and fighting for issues that they feel have been misheard or not heard at all. I think it was really important for me to kind of be involved with this and just to see that dynamic play out and the power dynamic of how the city of Austin interacted with the rest of the folks and residents of Austin. Seeing that dynamic play out and see how that manifests, in environmental planning and sustainability efforts. I think for me, just getting used to that and, talking to folks that have been through a lot of traumatic experiences, have been through a lot of harm that has been caused by the city of Austin, not just the past 10 years, but, going back to that 1928 master plan and even before that, the harm that has been caused by institutions like the city of Austin or even institutions like UT Austin, and the involvement that's tied to displacement, that's tied to these major gentrification problems. Overall, just incredibly shaping my understanding of sustainability and environmentalism and how it's much more complex than we think it is. And we really need to have this dialogue to talk about things that may bring discomfort, but are really powerful, great moments of growth on both ends. And it's not like an either or, it's us against them. It's really, we're trying to solve this climate issue together, but we really need to have a shared understanding of our history to move forward and actually address the issues we're talking about. We have to address those root causes to get to some solution. So a lot of this led to, luckily, fellowship came up. It was called an Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Fellowship. It was by the Office of Sustainability. Paths just lined up really nicely when the Office of Sustainability was trying to select an EDI fellow. And I think this was after my junior year of college. And I was like, heck yeah, I want to do this. This is exactly what I'm passionate about. Community resilience, everything that I've learned about flooding in Southeast Austin from community members, and the need to apply an equity lens to community resilience planning. Getting to assist the Office of Sustainability in discussions around community resilience, understanding that Austin is on its way to experience more intense shocks and stressors for heat, drought, wildfire, and flooding, and how that, relates to major health outcomes such as food insecurity, mental health, criminal justice issues, disease, obviously COVID-19, disease outbreak. We didn't know that at the time. This was the summer of 2018. So lined up pretty well. Things work out funny. And understanding that those that experience major inequities, low-income communities of color, this is a map of poverty in Travis County, and the Office of Sustainability using this data, quality of life outcome data, to center our community engagement strategies for community resilience with these neighborhoods, with these communities where we need to focus our efforts. because I think we all have seen maps like this where we see the racial divide across Austin. And this overlay, this pattern we see is very consistent when we think about median household income, when we think about tree canopy cover, when we think about chronic health diseases, very consistent with environmental justice issues and those that are the most impacted and have to recover from such events. Having these intro discussions with the Office of Sustainability, understanding that we're talking about community resilience. And right away, they understood that these are communities that have had to be resilient without the help of the city. And oftentimes in the past, with the mistrust of city government, often undermining a community's ability to be resilient in the face of chronic health stressors and other environmental impacts, such as flooding. That was our focus. It was the Dove Springs area, which is right here, south of Ben White Boulevard, and then north of East William Cannon Drive. So right here in this area, community that has experienced major flood events like the 2013, 2015, 16 Halloween floods. This is kind of just an overview of that fellowship. We were in partnership with Go Austin, Vamos Austin to help us lead this effort around community resilience. And as we can see, this community is located right in this floodplain. This is a lot of the data and maps I'm showing are a bit old compared to now 2022, but I'm just showing this because it's what I was working directly with during 2018. With this fellowship, we were having internal stakeholder discussions with City of Austin staff about the need to center racial equity in community resilience planning for climate efforts. And, where can we identify overlapping efforts with other city departments to come together for climate planning and to making sure our community is well prepared, but also understanding the major inequities these communities are already facing and how that directly undermines the ability to be resilient, and the city needing to really understand that these health outcomes are directly related and will be magnified by climate stressors. This was just our commitment for community resilience and how it should advance racial equity by focusing on low-income communities of color who have historically experienced a greater loss of life and will be impacted the most by climate change. While I was doing this EDI work, we were having internal stakeholder discussions. It was also having these internal discussions with the Office of Sustainability and having the shared dialogue and being vulnerable in what is our understanding of racial equity? Everyone is on a different path when we talk about racial equity and learning of how that manifests in our day-to-day life, how to manifest in planning efforts. Just this summer, so many discussions with staff like Mark Couder, who I worked directly under, and Rodrigo Leal. It was us three doing this climate resilience work, but really, working together, having this dialogue and working together, have these discussions with internal city staff, but also community leaders. With this fellowship, I did a lot of research on gathering stories and major lessons from the recent events in the past 10 to 20 years related to flooding issues in Southeast Austin. So I was reading through a lot of after action reports, news media coverage, community member stories, recovery stories, learned so much about the flood buyouts, learning so much about watershed protection and their role and what their work is all about, what y'all all do, the flood mitigation task force, and really just learning so much about how the city operates and when a disaster strikes, what are the procedures in place. With that, it was really important to also read these news stories and talk to community members to kind of hear their side of the story, to hear the reality of coordination efforts when it came to disaster preparedness and recovery. Because with these discussions, talking to a lot of community members, like community group called Dove Springs Proud, Ricardo Zavala, a community leader in Dove Springs, hearing from them saying, why would we think about relying on the city when this disaster happened? We were the ones going door to door, checking up on our neighbors. We were the ones who knew the context of our neighborhood and who we needed to go check on when something like this was happening. We were the ones gathering donations and doing donation drop-offs. Having that community knowledge, having that understanding of their networks in place, and, something that the city should look for as a major strength that they should support. Really, really important things like I learned about, and getting to have that dialogue with folks, getting to have those uncomfortable conversations, because when I'm sure y'all all know, when you're representing the city, talking with community members, there is kind of that mistrust of city government that you're walking in with as you're representing a city institution that has caused harm, but it's also trying to, address that harm and do better. Community leaders such as Ricardo or even Ofelia Zapata, who I think was a part of Austin Interfaith at the time, a lot of folks were just happy that the city was making the effort to talk with them, to grab coffee or to go to their community native spot to learn more about the issues specific to Dove Springs. Because as we were talking about the flood buyouts, as we were talking about flooding issues and climate change, there's even more things that came up, such as how Dove Springs had one of the highest population of youth compared to any other zip code through the rest of Austin. How there was major issues around healthcare access, issues around food deserts for their community, and how they have a high number of undocumented folks in their communities as well, and a high number of Spanish speakers. So you have all of these other intersecting identities and issues on top of the threat of climate change. You think you're just talking about climate change and flooding issues, but there's so much more to unpack there, like how all of it is really interrelated. I mentioned earlier we had internal stakeholders discussions and internal discussions, a lot of understanding how the city is pretty reactive at this time when doing community engagement, for example, like doing workshops or outreach after a major flood event happened, where obviously there are major stressors already present that need to be addressed in a proactive way. Also, I think common issue in city government of how not everything's unified. There's so many messages that different departments are sending out. I think there was a lot of issues with code at this time that wasn't aligned with what other departments were doing in terms of outreach and, working with the community, really recognizing and finding out like there's such an opportunity to gather different department stakeholders to create some unified message, whether it's related to community resilience or related to other health outcomes or health efforts. Also about funding, the need to just leverage funding internally because there's so many outstanding needs, but everyone's kind of fighting for their own budget. So how do we kind of come together to address these outstanding needs and leverage that internally? The second theme from our discussions was around external communications and engagement. I mentioned that there's obviously an inherent distrust of city agencies, oftentimes because there is a reactive process of outreach and engagement. So again, having that proactive engagement. These little bullet points are just kind of anecdotes of different departments. So like watershed protection and then public health emergency preparedness. We're all people, we're all human beings working in this institution. So obviously there's a kind of stress that goes on there trying to follow city timeline or city expectations and having to communicate that to community members. But I think that's okay. I think I had some meetings with folks where it's very tense and very much like, oh my gosh, I'm just the intern / fellow, please relax. But also understanding like people are experiencing major distressing problems, whether it's climate change or whether it's working in an institution like City of Austin where, the work that you want to do is undermined or not supported. So I think that's a common thing that people can find in their colleagues once we start talking about it and being more vulnerable and open about these challenges that, it's not just this department, it's also this department that, experiences this issue. The second concern here of strengthening the community preparedness, I remember talking to a parent support specialist, Leonor Vargas. I believe she retired just last year, but she was a parent support specialist. I don't think it was Mendez Middle School, but one of the elementary or middle schools. And just hearing from her how students were impacted from the floods, like some people having to live in an RV right outside their home because their house had mold and so much damage from flooding. Just the trauma of the flood that some students don't even come to school anymore when it rains on a normal day. I've heard that recently too from a teacher at Rodriguez Elementary School working with EcoRise. I heard the same thing. I was like, wow, that's continues 5-10 years later. But yeah, parent support specialist, she was directly involved in a lot of the response to climate emergency. And she had so much ideas, so much feedback of like, the city should do this. We should have a emergency budget for something like this happens. Bus cards for Cap Metro cards for students to get to school. Just a lot of ideas and feedback. And again, this is probably one of the first times she's ever been reached out to by a city employee to kind of talk about community resilience, emergency response as it relates to flooding. During this time, we were building a lot of relationships with folks. And I was happy to I'm not going to be here forever as a fellow. So trying to introduce my community connections, but also the new community connections that we both developed to make sure it carries on, not just for the summer, but for how the Office of Sustainability manages their work and how they engage and work with the community. Because that goes with the third concern here, an opportunity of building accountability and relationships with folks rather than just showing up as a city staff to talk at folks about what they're doing to change their community, whether it's the built or social environment. We learned so much about safe spaces and physical projects. The Southeast Branch public librarian, she talked to us so much about, she was involved in a lot of the flood response, making sure like folks that attended her library, Spanish speakers, were getting the resources they needed, and how she really tries to minimize barriers to make sure the library is a safe space for folks in the community. Because again, this is a community that has a high number of Spanish speakers. And also from her, this was like one of the first times she ever talked to like a city staff member about like climate change efforts and community resilience. Just a lot of great knowledge that we heard about, relationship building, talking to folks, getting a feel for what are issues that we need to, or barriers that we have to consider doing community resilience work with the city in collaboration with other departments, kind of needing to be all on the same page with our framing, thinking about climate efforts. Which leads, I'm going to kind of wrap up, but this kind of goes to the climate plan. This is a slide from Dr. Tane Ward, who led our climate equity workshops, where we gathered community members and city staff members and other stakeholders together to help develop the climate equity plan. And why are we here? To make this climate action anti-racist. And with that, having to dive deep into our history and how city planning processes have been in the past and what it has contributed to. And I think this is really important, utilizing data to kind of have people respond to these images and data sets and to tell their story, their lived experience of living in Austin and what this has been like for them, whether it's displacement, the loss of culture, but also how it continues to be perpetuated and how it's a common cultural issue that city staff need to recognize of how we go about a city planning process. So these were images that Tane used during our workshops, where we kind of took time to respond in small groups to the images and then share out loud of what these images or charts make people think about and respond to, or like life anecdotes to kind of provide that lived experience and knowledge to share with the folks in the workshop. We had about 5 of these. Tane also used a lot of historical images. This top left image was in 2009, the death of Nathaniel Sanders II from an APD officer. It's one of the most notorious events related to APD at the time. But understanding these issues around criminal justice issues, police brutality, and how this has been a narrative and lived experience for the Black African American community, and also the loss of culture for communities of color in Austin, and how the city, perpetuates and continues these legacies of racism, and how that, it is a climate issue. It's directly related to the quality of life. I'm really glad Tane incorporated, because we need this history. A lot of folks, even, from Austin, didn't know a lot about this historic knowledge. The bottom photo, this is where the IHOP is, off I-35 by Rainey Street. Forgot the name. I believe it was the Institute of Chicano History, and this was a mural. And the photo on the bottom right is the protest to not bulldoze it, and they ended up bulldozing, taking it down. It was like, I believe I think there's one of 2 of these across Texas, but the city of Austin completely allowed it to be bulldozed down, and it didn't really get turned into anything substantial. This is just where there it is. It's the Horace Lincoln Institute. This was it, and then this was the mural on the side of it, and this is now where the IHOP is. So thinking about the loss of culture and disrespect, throwing it out, and, we've seen what's been done to Rainey Street. And these were questions Tane was asking. How do we think of the response from the city to these issues? How have policies aided the displacement of communities of color? And teaching us about white supremacy culture and how can we apply a justice litmus to our climate plan efforts. So this sense of urgency, either or thinking, paternalism, fear of conflict, and so on, and how this shows up in our collaboration efforts and obviously City of Austin planning efforts. And I love this slide that Tane shared, thinking about creating the culture we want. Culture is constantly in the process of being created. It's dynamic. Each and every one of us produce culture through our interaction with the world. And these are critical issues of power, are always cultural. And culture allows us to look critically at structures of power and culture is material. Thinking about our cultural preservation of Austin and how Austin today looks so much different than how it did 10 years, 20 years, 30, 40 years ago. And what does that say about, our values and what we support? I was going to talk a bit about the climate plan, but I know I'm running out of time. From this workshop, we ended up developing 7 themes for the climate equity plan. These themes ended up in our equity tool for the climate plan because these just arose from Tani's workshop when we were talking about what are our values? What do we want to see in this climate plan? What do we want to have centered moving forward? This is what we came up with. Understanding doing climate change to eliminate the use of fossil fuels and trying to eliminate disparities that can be predicted by race. They're inextricably linked. And if we're not proactively addressing equity, we're just going to continue perpetuating the injustices that we talked and learned about during these workshops. So again, these are just ended up being part of our equity tool and what we led with in the climate plan. Had a really cool climate ambassador program. I think from this, when we talk about climate change, again, we have to talk about community priorities, whether that's food access, language access, people with disabilities, elders, youth perspectives, and cultural issues related to affordability and displacement. These folks were really instrumental in working with us to lead an equity-centered community engagement process that we co-created together in collaboration. So that's all for me. Kind of sped through that, so I hope that was helpful for the last part.
It was incredibly helpful, Celine. So thank you for joining us to talk about the complexity and importance of this and how we as a department can broaden our vision to see these intersectionalities and get comfortable with the discomfort and really work to value and center our work on the wisdom of the community. So thank you for making time to do that today.